Continuing our study through the ages, how the Bible came to us. And as we begin this morning, we'll do a little bit of review. In our first lesson, we talked about how God has revealed Himself, and we said in that lesson that there are two classes or two major groups of revelation. What are those two big groupings of the way that God has revealed Himself? All right. General and specific or special. Now that general is that God has revealed Himself through all that He has created. So we can come to know certain aspects of who God is by looking at all that He has done in the natural world. We can see that He is a God of order, that He is a God of balance, that He is a God of beauty. Perhaps we could even see that He is a God of free will when we look at the created world. But then we also talk about that other class of revelation that is special revelation. What do we mean when we talk about special revelation? Miracles, angels, direct speech, dreams, visions. And what is the difference between this special revelation and this general revelation? We get a much deeper understanding of God's character. We have essentially, without the special revelation, God is going to remain at a certain distance from us because we can't really know enough about Him to feel like we know Him. Would we agree or disagree? So this special revelation allows us to know God to the degree that we can have a relationship with Him. And of course, what is the crowning example of this special revelation? Jesus. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So He's even described as revelation in John 1. And of course, the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews 1:1, long ago, at times past, in many ways, God revealed Himself through the prophets, but in these last days, He has revealed Himself through His Son. And so Jesus is the star example, if you will, of this special revelation. Now, that was the first class. In the second class, we talked about how the Bible is inspired, accurate, and authoritative. What does inspired mean? God-breathed, meaning God is the source of Scripture. Now, because He is the source of Scripture, we expect it to be accurate, but why would that even be a question? Because even though God is the source of Scripture, He utilized human beings to deliver that Scripture. But we noted the accuracy of Scripture in several areas. We talked about its historical accuracy. We talked about its scientific accuracy. We talked about the archaeological record. And so we saw several examples of its accuracy. And then we said, if the Bible claims to be from God, and it can be shown that it is from God, and then it can be shown that it is accurate, that means we've got to pay attention to it. And in fact, if God tells us to do something, or many things, and He does, then we have to listen because it's from God and it's accurate. And so it is authoritative. Now, are we required by God, or let me rephrase, does God give us a choice as to whether or not we will recognize His authority in Scripture? Yes, we are not machines that have to obey our code. We are free will beings that choose whether or not we will recognize and obey what God has said in Scripture. All right, then last week we talked about the form of our Bible. We talked about the divisions into testaments or covenants. And we said that the two major divisions of our Bible are called testaments. That's from the Latin testamentum. But by that is meant the covenants that are mentioned in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6. This idea that prior to the coming of Jesus, God's people lived under the covenant, presumably the law of Moses, But now, because of Jesus Christ, we live under a better covenant, and we call that covenant our New Testament. That is the basis of our relationship with God. The promises that He makes to us and how we are to respond to Him are found in our New Testament. Is the Old Covenant obsolete? Okay. I guess it depends on what we mean by obsolete. So if we're using the language of Hebrews, we might say it's obsolete in that it is no longer in effect. But does that mean it has no role in our faith? No. The Old Testament, the Old Covenant, still has much to teach us and helps us have a better understanding of the New Covenant. We talked about the divisions into chapters and verses that came much later in history. We also talked about the three languages in which the Bible was composed: Hebrew and Aramaic, two Semitic languages written from right to left. And then that's our Old Testament. There are some Aramaic phrases in the New Testament because Jesus and other first century Jews spoke Aramaic. But our New Testament is composed in Greek. And we noted the advantage of the New Testament being written in Greek. What was special about that? Greek was the common language. I do think it would probably be a fair comparison to say that Greek in the first century is similar to what English is in our world. That you can go to many pockets of the world, whether you go to Europe or to Asia or to Africa, and there are people who either know English or they're doing their best to learn it because it is the language that is most frequently spoken in our world. That doesn't mean everyone knows it, but it is more well known than perhaps any other language worldwide. All right, today we're going to talk about the making of ancient books. Is the Bible the oldest book ever written? No, it is not. We're just going to look at a few pieces of evidence here. There was a time when critics of the Bible said it is not possible for Moses to have been the author of the Old Testament because, simply put, people weren't writing books that far back in history. Now that claim has been disproven, and we're not going to look at all the evidence, but we'll look at a little bit together this morning. What you see on the screen is called the Kish tablet. It has been dated to approximately 3500 BC. Now remember the way that we do math with BC and AD. That would be 2023 plus 3500. So you're talking about 5,700 years ago this tablet was created. It says on the screen this is the oldest extant evidence of writing. Now, I put that word extant in italics because I know it may not be familiar to you, so I'm going to give you a simple explanation of it. It's a very common word when we talk about archaeological evidence. It means the oldest to have been discovered. The oldest to have been discovered. What does that mean? Is it possible that there is writing still in the archaeological record older than this? We just haven't discovered it yet. That's why we use the word extant. So right now, this is the one that we know of that is oldest. If you'll look at the tablet, you'll see, do you see letters on the tablet? What do you see on the tablet? Pictures. These have been understood to be what's called ideographs. You'll see different words assigned to these pictures. Ideographs or ideograms or also pictograms. Now, we don't use those words in our everyday language, but you have seen pictograms. If you look at a street sign with a person crossing a crosswalk, that is a pictogram. Or the image that you see on the screen of bottles that have those little square diamond-shaped labels, those are pictograms. So these pictograms represent words or ideas. Well, that's very significant that they found this tablet that has multiple pictograms. That is, some message or some story is being told by these pictures. And these are considered the precursor to hieroglyphics. So before there were hieroglyphics, there were these pictograms. The hieroglyphics then come next. And then what follows hieroglyphics would be some kind of written alphabet. So the oldest tablet that we have found is from 5,700 years ago. Well, 3,500 BC. Moses is presumed to have lived something like 1,500 BC. So this is 2,000 years before Moses. So is it impossible for Moses to have written a book? Not hardly. The book that I mentioned last week that is a sort of standard on this topic, How We Got the Bible, by Neil Lightfoot, he says, we know now that writing was generally practiced many centuries before Moses, which means it can no longer be assumed that it was impossible for Moses to have written the books ascribed to him. And of course, taking all the evidence, we believe the Bible when it says that Moses wrote the first 5 books. Jesus himself refers to Moses as the author of the law, the first 5 books. Now let's spend some time, the rest of our time, talking about the various materials that were used in the making of ancient books. And we're going to look at 5 different materials. I've taken some and combined them, and we'll talk about the various categories within those. But as we look at these, we're also going to note examples from Scripture. And this itself shows us the historical accuracy and consistency of the Bible, in that these various tools and materials that we have found are referenced in the Bible in their appropriate setting. And so the first is stone. Can you think of anywhere in the Bible where something is written in stone? The 10 Commandments. You go back to Exodus, and Moses receives the 10 Commandments, and the first copy of the 10 Commandments, who wrote that copy? God wrote that copy, and he wrote it in stone. Now what happened to it? We talked about this last week. Moses broke it. And he had to go back up on the mountain. So this is Exodus 20 and then Exodus 32. Has to go back up on the mountain and he has to rewrite them. But who writes them that time? Moses. Okay. We have other examples as well of writing in stone. One is found in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 2 and 3. Do I have a volunteer that's willing to read Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 2 and 3? Yes, Sid. All right, thank you. It says that you shall cover them, the New American Standard says, with lime. The ESV says with plaster. And presumably the reason for that is they would then have etched out in the plaster some wording to remind them of this historic crossing into the promised land. Because God had made this promise to the children of Israel when he made it to Abraham. And so that he has now brought them into this land that he promised is highly consequential. And so they set up a monument. And the reason for plastering the stone was it would have been easier to etch in the plaster than it would be in the natural stone. So we have several examples of etching in stone. Now we use that word etching. They would have used some kind of metal instrument to make markings in the stone. And this is definitely, so far as the current evidence is concerned, the most ancient form of writing is in stone. Now the second is in clay. Now just imagine, how would people write in clay as opposed to writing on stone? You think it would be easier to write in clay or on stone? On the clay. Now how are you going to write on the clay? You're going to have a wooden stylus. We use the word stylus today to refer to what we write on our digital devices, but it originally referred to a sharp instrument that was used to write. Now, but when you write on the clay, is it dry or is it wet? It'd be wet, and then what would you do with it? You would fire it up, right? You would put it in some kind of oven, and that would set the writing in the clay. We have examples of this as well in Scripture. One is found in Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 1. Now, some of these are clearer than others. Some of these we have to look at the context, but this one is pretty clear. The text says, "And you, son of man, take a brick and lay it before you and engrave on it a city, even Jerusalem." Now let me ask you a question, even before we move forward. When we talk about looking at the archaeological record, which one of these do you think we're more likely to find intact? Writing in stone or writing in clay? Stone. It's got a little bit more hardiness to it, whereas the clay is prone to being broken. All right. The next is wood, and I don't claim to be an expert on any of these. The wood, I did look at some different sources about this, and in some cases the wood was actually overlaid with wax, and they would write in the wax, and then when they were presumably done with that document, then they could actually heat it up and put new wax on it. In other cases, that the stylus would actually cut through the wax into the wood. You see there an image of wood tablets, and the Old Testament also refers to these tablets in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 2. And if I've understood correctly, the Hebrew word that is used for tablet in Habakkuk 2:2 indicates that it is likely wooden. And to go through and sing the minor prophets to remember exactly where Habakkuk is. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk. Habakkuk 2:2. The Lord answered me, "Write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it." So far, looking at any of these, do they seem like good material sources for lengthy written documents? Not unless you have special storage for them. None of these lend themselves to a book even of this size, do they? These are generally used for special occasions, for moments like we looked at there in Deuteronomy that you want to preserve and remember that moment. But they're not so great for extended instruction. Now, the clay and the wood may be slightly better than the stone, but imagine carrying around enough clay tablets for even 2 chapters of this book without breaking them, no less. Not really realistic. Now, the wood may have been slightly better, but still you're limited on that as well. So now we're going to get into the major categories that are used ultimately for the preservation of Scripture. While we may have seen examples of these others in the Bible, they would not have been ideal for extended literary pieces. And the first category that I have on the screen is leather, and you'll also see there vellum. Leather and vellum are not the same, but they start with essentially the same material. So we'll talk about each one of those. Leather is one of the oldest that we have for more extended writing. And the way that leather was used is that the leather would be tanned. We're familiar with the idea of tanning leather. The leather was tanned and then it was used for writing. In some cases, this was scratching on the leather. In other cases, it was through the use of some kind of stylus with ink. And the various inks that were produced over time changed. But we do see some examples of this. The one that's listed on the screen, Jeremiah 36:23, is when the king is actually cutting up Jeremiah's scroll and throwing it in the fire. But the knife that he's using is a scribe's knife. And the reason that that is important is if you made a mistake in the leather, you would take this knife and you would scratch the word off. No eraser. You can't do that on leather. But they would take the knife and they would just scratch it out. And then they would continue writing on beyond it. And so the king has this knife, but instead of scratching out a word here or there, he's so displeased with Jeremiah's message from the Lord that he just reads a part of the leather scroll, and then he cuts it off, and he throws it in the fire. He reads another part, he cuts it off, and he throws it in the fire. Now, what comes after leather ultimately is vellum. Who here knows what the word veal means? Veal is what? So veal is calf. There, some would consider also certain species of deer in the same category of veal, but it is a calf of very tender meat, and that you see the relationship between the word veal and the word vellum. Now, what they would do is they would take the skin of a calf of certain species, and they would strip the fur, and they would clean the meat. But then instead of tanning the leather, they would beat it out with a stone so that it became similar to paper. But of course, can you imagine, it's a little bit hardier than paper? Many of our ancient manuscripts of the Bible are on vellum. And vellum was highly prized, and really papyrus comes before vellum, but since it's related to leather, I put them together on the screen. It becomes highly prized. Many of our best manuscripts of the New Testament, you're talking 4th century onward, are on vellum because it lasts. It lasts. Now there were some special uses of vellum. You can see some very fancy manuscripts of our New Testament. One of the favored methods of using vellum at a certain point in history was to take it and dye it purple, and then to write on it with either silver or gold engraving. Well, you can imagine that would be very aesthetically pleasing, very beautiful, not especially practical. These are very expensive manuscripts. And so leather and vellum. Then the other is papyrus. And I'll talk to you about papyrus. Does anybody know where we get papyrus? From reeds. A papyrus originates in Egypt. At one time in Egypt, the reeds that were grown were especially conducive for the making of this papyrus. And it's the precursor to modern paper. That they would strip the papyrus and they would make it into fine strips. And then they would use a certain kind of glue and they would glue it together. And the papyrus reeds would run one direction on one side, and they would run the intersecting direction on the other side. And what was special about papyrus was it was lightweight. And many of our ancient scrolls are made of papyrus. They would actually, using the similar glue that they used, they would weave together multiple pages in a lengthy set, and then they would have a scroll. And of course, you've seen the wooden rollers that they use on these scrolls. And they would write on the papyrus. They would usually only write on one side. That has to do with the running of the reeds, the direction that they ran. It just made more sense. The other thing that you'll see, both in the leather, the vellum, and the papyrus, is that writing was done in columns. Now, if you look at, say, a book like this one, there's a single column on each page. But then you look at many of our Bibles, and they have 2 or 3 columns. on these scrolls, they would write in columns of a certain width. And you may not be able to see it very well on the screen, but if you'll look at both images on the screen, you'll notice that there aren't really any spaces between the words. And so you had to know, you had to start at the beginning. It wasn't like you could pick up in the middle, because you have to know where you started. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to know what word is being represented. And they wouldn't even put dashes in some of these languages if they broke a word from one line to the next. Well, they just kept writing. So you really have to start at the beginning. It lends itself to reading from beginning to end and not stopping in the middle. So they would take these scrolls, and of course they would carry them. But then something developed around the time of the first century that revolutionized the world and also was a great boon for Christianity. That using papyrus and then vellum, the codex was developed. And a codex is the taking of these sheets, laying them on top of each other, and binding them together. Today we call it a book. And you could put much more together on a codex than even on a scroll. So a scroll of a book of our Bible like Isaiah would be pretty big. You've got the added weight of the wooden rollers that you need. You've got to have excess space, because as you roll it out, you don't want the words to be covered. But with the codex, you have a standard page, and you can lay the pages on top of each other, and then they're bound together. And you can carry much more information in one place. Now, technologically speaking, we're talking now beyond the making of the Bible. We have continued to advance in the amount of information that we can carry on our person, haven't we? You think about how significant it is to jump from a scroll to a codex. You think about in your lifetime and even in mine, how significantly we have shifted in the amount of information we can carry on our person. Now this example is going to date me, and some of you, I hope it doesn't make anyone feel old. But I remember when I bought my first thumb drive. You know what I'm talking about? A little USB drive. And it had 256 megabits on it. I was like, man, this is incredible. Think about how much I can store on this. And now that's nothing. Or you look at these cell phones, and we've gone from kilobytes to megabytes to gigabytes, and now terabytes. And the amount of information that can be stored. But you see how that has changed the way that we view information. You can imagine then how it changed the world and the way that people viewed the world when they began to carry larger collections of information in a manageable format. Now, we'll talk some more next time. Now, next week, Frank will be with you teaching on a totally different subject. I'll be out, and then we'll resume this study the following week. But we will look at Revelation 5, but we'll talk more about how this comes into direct connection with our copies of the Bible. But in Revelation chapter 5, verse 1, John says, "Then I saw in the right hand of him who was seated on the throne a scroll written within and on the back, sealed with 7 seals." Now, this is unique. It is not that we have no examples of paper that was written on the front and back, but it was not common in the ancient world. Vellum, the way that vellum was developed, it was a bit difficult to write on both sides. The way that papyrus was made, it was a bit difficult to write on both sides. So to have writing on both sides was unique. You can imagine, though, how much more space it took when you only write on one side, and the expense, because paper and vellum were not cheap. There was a lot of work that went into producing them, and therefore they were expensive. Now all these automated processes, and we have trees that are grown solely for the purpose of making paper pulp, it's gotten to be relatively inexpensive. In fact, in some regards, it may be too cheap because people don't value books the way that they once did. That's a whole other conversation, but it does affect the way that we view the Bible because the Bible is a book. Nevertheless, when you had certain vellum manuscripts written on one side and then written on the other side, you had to deal with the different textures. There's also something called a palimpsest. I don't have this on the screen. A palimpsest is a manuscript, usually of vellum, in which there is writing that has been scraped off and written over. And we actually have some of our ancient manuscripts of the New Testament are palimpsest manuscripts. And so there was a copy of the Bible, and someone decided they needed that paper, I'm using the term loosely, for something else, and they wrote over it, or perhaps the other way around. And so we actually have X-ray technology and other technologies that we use now to determine the different layers of writing, which is just fascinating, but also comes into our conversation about the manuscripts that we have available to us of our Bible. And when you look at all of this, we're almost done. What stands out to you when thinking about these various materials that were used for writing? Yes, Sid? Yeah. Everything that's used is from nature. It's from God. Good. What else? Is it amazing to you that we have gone from writing on stone and clay and wood and leather and rudimentary paper to this product? Is that fascinating to you? That through all of those various stages of history that God oversaw and saw to it that what He said was preserved in a way that we still have access to it and we can trust it and know that it's accurate? Isn't that a story of God's providence for us? Because how many documents written on these various kinds of materials from the ancient world have survived? Not many. Not many at all. And so it is an amazing testament to God's provision for us that we have this book through all of those means. So why do we need to know this information? Frank? It reinforces our faith? Good. Sid? Yeah. We're standing not on assumptions, but on evidence, to use maybe a scientific term, but nevertheless an accurate one. I think we can gain a greater appreciation for what we have, knowing how costly and precarious, that is, how fragile the process was, and yet we've got it. So we have a greater appreciation for it coming to us. Alan? So you see the devotion of God's people through time, that they were willing to go to this incredible effort to create with God as the source, these documents, if we can use the word document for stone or clay, but to create these written pieces, and then the effort that it would have taken to preserve those pieces. What else? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
What gives credit to the fact that we haven't made that up? Because we've proven it. So the opportunity God has always given away. It's your choice.
Mm-hmm.
It's always going to
Yeah.
be your choice. I'm not going to make it so clear and blunt
Mm-hmm.
that you can't deny me. It is
Mm-hmm.
your choice.
Yeah.
As it carries through, I find that.
Yeah. So looking at, I'm reviewing this because the recording can't hear you. Looking at everything that Sid said, there was seeing God's character throughout the process, knowing that even though we have all these pieces of evidence, we also have the question of, well, weren't there other copies? And so God has left us room for faith, that He is not going to force us to believe. He's given us the freedom to choose whether or not we're going to accept what He has to say. And we even see that in these various methods of recording information over time and preserving them. Frank?
To reinforce that, I mean, nothing is beyond God. He could create a Bible every year and present it to mankind in the perfect format, and it would be an undeniable miracle that everybody could accept. But no, it takes more than that. It's through the foolishness of preaching
Mm-hmm.
that man comes to believe and grow in faith.
Yeah, so God chose to make Himself known through human efforts rather than this idea that some people have that the Bible descended from heaven on a golden pillow. And actually, as we then get into discussions later of manuscripts and this idea that, well, the King James versus these other translations, we're going to talk about the manuscripts standing behind those, because what you mentioned, Sid, was, well, how do we know if these are the right ones? Well, actually, we have various traditional strands of manuscripts. They don't have great disagreement, but they do have some disagreement, and God has placed it within our responsibility to evaluate the evidence and determine which ones are most trustworthy. And so He's given us that responsibility. Now, if you read from a Bible that's based on this manuscript family and a Bible that's based on that manuscript family, you're going to come away with the same core truths. That doesn't change. That gives us confidence that what we believe is right. But there may be a few slightly different details. And we'll talk about what those are. I don't want to concern anybody by bringing that up without then addressing them, but we will address them in this class. All right, well, thank you all for your participation and attention. I'll see you in 2 weeks.